Wheel of Genre, the show for readers who long to be Lord of the Worm. Each week we spin the wheel and land on a new genre. Spies, mystery, horror, romance, SF. It's all on the shelf. And right now we are reading every short story in Harlan Ellison's anthology, Dangerous Visions, including this one, Keith Laumer's Test to Destruction. I'm Zach, and I'm really interested in figuring out with you exactly what the themes are of this story, because it feels like we have a bouquet here, and I just want to know if you feel like they all work together in a complementary fashion.
Yes, do we have a bucket or a bouquet? Were you making a Dune reference? Because my first note is, this is Miles Tegg and the T-Probe, only not sexy. Are we the Lord of the Worm?
Well, all the aliens are like worms, right? Isn't that like, there's like that reveal at the end that their spaceship is only like 28 centimeters long or something like that?
Oh my God, that was the... I did not get that. Okay, to me it was really high-minded, like conceptual sci-fi, and now I hear it's just a worm land. Oh.
I think that what we have here is a case of real like science fiction complexity, if that makes sense. And I don't mean like complexity in the sense of like nuance. I mean complexity in the sense of there's a lot going on here. And I think that if the author wanted to, they could take a whole book, a whole novel to really flesh this out. But instead what we get is a kind of like a dystopian plot, a torture session. We're introduced to an alien race which seems to work according to rules that we're not really familiar with, but are kind of hurriedly in a hand-wavy way kind of, introduced into the story. We have a sense of consciousness leaving the body. We don't really know what the rules of that are. And then we have a kind of political allegory where the revolutionaries always become the future dictators. So there's just a lot going on. And I think for both of us, it becomes a lot to keep track of. This is one of the longest stories in Dangerous Visions, and yet it feels like there wasn't enough time spent on it. I don't know.
Yes,
what do you think, Bob?
It's quite... I'm quite impressed with it, even though it's hard to read. It is impressive to be this committed to an idea and to put so much of the world into it. Like, this feels like a story, yes, people jump into and start narrating brilliant stories that are a lot of fun adventures, but this is like, no, I have a really specific idea, and I'm going to throw people into it and try and make the idea come to life for them. But I think I want to still look at this idea of resisting to steal an X-Files title. I'm going to say, I want to look at this idea of, fighting the future, because he says in his afterword, I began this one with the concept of submitting a human being to an ultimate trial in the same way that an engineer will load a beam until it collapses, testing it to destruction. And so, the title is Test to Destruction. I think the allegory itself at the end is not that interesting, where yes, anyone, what is it? Power corrupts absolute. Anyway, absolute power corrupts absolutely. But I think what's interesting is it's like a Jack Bauer story, 24, where it's action, 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 but then it's one's mental process, one's psychological ability, not even psychological ability, just one's ability to think. And in that ability to think, they're able to throw off the chains of this dictator that uses technology to control people. And in so doing, they then take technology back into their own hands. So Mallory the human takes technology back into his own hands. And whether or not it's a human dictator, I don't think that's that interesting. But the idea of a technology is mine again, not I'm controlled by it, but again, it's in my hand. I think that's an interesting science fiction element in this story.
I like what you're saying, but I don't know. Part of the deal with this story is that there's so many things going on. It actually really put into focus for me that there are aspects of science fiction that I really enjoy, and there are aspects of science fiction that I just don't really have the appetite for anymore. And one of the stylistic things I noticed with this one is that many parts of this story are just pure action sequences. If you compare that to the previous one we just read, Judas by John Brunner, that's mostly dialogue. How did you feel about this stylistically, like on a writing level? I think it's the most action-y story that we've read in this entire collection.
Yes. This is something I really wanted to talk about, action, because I was wondering, when someone is writing like this, are they... Okay, sorry, let me give you two examples. If we take the Iliad, Homer is doing action where it's just absolutely horrendous, like the most violent things you've ever read, and really beautiful to watch at the same time. A spear will go through the back of someone's head, lodge, so it takes the eyeball with it, travels. While we look at, the sun dappled on the ground, and men grunting and hitting each other while they're bleeding, and then finally the spear flies past one shoulder, anyway. Very fun to read. Here, I'm wondering if sometimes writing is just channeling TV, because it just feels like I'm watching TV. I am no longer using my brain in a way that books will often make me use, and I'm just seeing, and maybe this is good because we call it smooth. At least lots of people, when they review books recently, they say, wow, it only took me 5 hours to read this. It was so smooth. I have no speed bumps. I could just see it. Sometimes that's great. You want a really strong image. However, this is just me going for an hour, because it's just someone jumping over things exploding, and obviously I'm going to see it. However, in the J.G. Ballard story, they talk about a Saul Bellow quote, and I think it's very interesting to look at here, because they say, the Saul Bellow said in 1963, a story should be interesting. Highly interesting, as interesting as possible, inexplicably absorbing. There can be no other justification for any piece of fiction. And I started thinking about how people talk, when they do a workshop of fiction, and they always say, the author cannot speak. They're in the box. You have to only critique the piece. In the 1960s, 1950s, when we had this idea of the death of the author, I feel like this is such a foreign and weird idea. When you take the author out of it and you're not interested in it, and you're just critiquing the piece about how well you were immersed in it. Because the author's writing things, Harlan Ellison is talking about living forever. And if we just completely ignore the author and only talk about the piece, we kind of forget about their, living eternally. But the style of this is just, I'm writing action, and I hope it's smooth for you. And I just feel like that action should be cut. I guess, what do you think of the experience of making reading like TV, as smooth as TV? Is there a time that it's good? Is there a time that it's bad? Is it unfair to say that reading that is like watching TV is not as good as some other kind of reading?
Well, we just read Graham Greene's The End of the Affair, and that's a book, I think, with almost no action in it. It's entirely kind of just like the narrator speaking. And when the narrator isn't speaking, he's reading the diary of another character, in which case it's literally just another different narrator speaking. So it's a story that plays out in thought. It plays out in the ideas, and it plays out in observations of the world much more than a story like this, which plays out in events. And first this happened, and then that happened, and that triggered this, and that set off that. It's hard. I think that the issue is with this kind of writing, it's that when it's so smooth like that, it slips through the fingers. It's so slick that I can't get a grasp on it in the sense of, how do I apply it to myself? Where am I in this story? Where is my world in this story? And if it's just some guy running around, fighting off some bad guys, getting tortured, there's nothing sticky to it. A story that's pure action and pure event, it has no stickiness to it. I need interiority in my fiction. And I think that's the lesson, the fundamental lesson of this story for me.
Interiority in the fiction. I'm sorry about my whole Saul Bellow thing, but here is the reason why I wanted to mention that. You're talking about a lasting impression on the reader that is important, because it's like their soul has been changed or talked to, because the writer has done something very interesting that the reader has not come across before. However, I think in this, when it's just action, there's the inspiration. So speaking as someone who likes to write a lot, you do have these moments where wow, I'm really seeing this. I'm just going to write everything that I see. Wow, it's flowing through me just like television. This is amazing. Everything is so clear. And it's like you've convinced yourself you're in a dream. And then you narrate, no one likes to hear your dreams, but you're narrating this dream for a long, long time, and it's so clear to you, and you think, okay, the muse has talked to me. This is real inspiration. I'm really expressing my soul. And then you look at it later and you think, what the hell did I write? Why did I write that? It's just a bunch of action. It's entertaining sometimes, but sometimes it's not. It's just empty inspiration. And that's why I was thinking about this writer leaving an impression on the reader that will last eternally. And I wonder, when we talk about stories and when we talk about, wow, it's really smooth, or it was edited really well, or the plot really fell together, or they did it just the right way, I give it 5 stars. What the hell is the point of that? If we're just going to rate books at 5 stars, we're just ordering rankings. We're just putting up rankings. And what that will really do is just say, this book is 5 stars because it's like any other action book and it's the perfect archetype of action books. But why don't we talk about what the reader or what the writer is experiencing in that inspiration? Why don't we think about, when we do like a workshop of a story, what does the story really mean for the writer to express themselves? Not just it's a tight story, but this is something important happening in the person writing this, because that will be more authentic if it's the soul really expressing itself. If the muse has really come down, or if the inspiration is true, shouldn't we be looking at that too? Not just, wow, that is a good craftsmanship, but wow, this is a true jewel from divine inspiration or something like that. So action or not, I think there's got to be something authentic in the inspiration.
So it sounds like, if I understand you correctly, you want to give this story props for having a kind of crystal clear vision of what the author wants to tell. Is that so? Like, regardless of style, regardless of execution, the point of inspiration for this story, you think, is very special, and the author's ability to bring all of these disparate elements together into a cohesive story that, even if we struggled with it, it sounds like you value it for its ability to bring it all into being. Is that correct?
Well, I wouldn't exactly. I'm saying that the action here isn't bringing anything into being. It's bringing emptiness. It's bringing television into being. And I don't think that the action is very useful here, because it's the author kind of turning off and saying, I'm going to channel what I see. But that channeling is all from images seen through television or images seen through movies. And I wonder if that happens to a lot of authors. We've read lots of genres now, and if you are just repeating the genre and it's totally formulaic, I'm not going to say which book, but there was a romance book where it's just someone watching basically television and describing it. I've seen a romantic movie. Now I'm going to turn my brain off for the next year while I write this and just describe everything I've seen in television before, and there's my romance. I think in this, there's a really cool idea. I still think the idea of just using your mind to overpower the machine so the machine is yours again is quite cool. But I think this inspiration that someone feels when they write action like this, it's not real inspiration. There's something empty about it. Okay, I think the bone I'm trying to pick and that I want to try and express here is this idea, we've been reading so much Jung, so please forgive me, but there's the idea of kind of exploiting one's unconscious, trying to say, give me this, give me this, give me this. It's like you're pimping your unconscious. And I think from experience, writing so much, when you force yourself to write all the time, yeah, that's great. You got to go get your pages in, you got to get your word count in. But sometimes when you just jump into something that feels like inspiration, it could be a trick, and maybe you should still follow it, but maybe you don't publish it. But that trick feels like, okay, I finally see this action scene. Now for the next hour, I'm going to narrate that action scene because it's so crystal clear to me. So yes, that's extremely fun. You should do that and write this down. But I have a feeling sometimes it's the unconscious just saying, okay, fuck you, here's a rerun. It just puts on a rerun for you. And that rerun is just recordings from television because it's seen so much television. It's like, you asshole, you've made me watch so many hours of television before. I'm going to give it back to you. Yeah. And there's this idea, of just using your unconscious to give you things and you don't actually listen to it. We have this ego self-access and we have to actually understand according to Jung, what our unconscious is, what our self is, which includes the unconscious, the ego, and all of that other good stuff. But if we're just saying, give me this idea, give me this new idea, give me this new story idea, and we don't actually listen to what these ideas really mean to us and what they're trying to tell us about who we are, I feel like that's why I mentioned the Saul Bellow thing is in the workshop, you're just workshopping this dead piece of art. And that's fine. But what happens if we don't listen to our fiction? What is our fiction trying to tell us? If we're trying to really understand our imagination, are we just going to exploit it and say, give me, give me, give me? Or are we going to say, okay, why did my imagination give me this? What is my unconscious actually trying to communicate to me? How can I develop my soul, or how can I develop my psyche? Same thing. But how do I do that? And how do I do it that's not just reruns?
Yeah.
So,
well,
anyway.
Isn't this really what people have against Stephen King? Like, his famous writing technique is basically he's just going to sit down and write first thought, best thought through an entire manuscript. And yeah, he spends a lot of time after that editing. But I always thought that the beef that people had with him was that, it goes in line with this. Like, if you're just dishing out what your subconscious is serving, you're gonna put a lot of stuff on the page that is essentially just reruns, trope heavy material, or even cliche heavy material. And I wouldn't really dismiss Stephen King that way, but I think, a lot of people would. Stephen King's hard because he has iconic books, truly iconic books, but he also has a lot of books, and he's certainly not an author that bats 1,000 by any stretch. So, yeah, but he was the first person who came to my mind. But I think that really what that applies to most, what you're saying, is this story right here.
Stephen King, I'm really glad you brought up Stephen King. We should wrap this up soon. But Stephen King, I think we cannot say is just always reruns. I think he's just a freak. Like there are people who just, they're unconscious and they're just like best buddies. Stephen King, his writing practice and his unconscious, I think, are best friends. I think he is truly in touch, and he loves it, and he appreciates it, and he gives it its due. I don't think he's trying to exploit it. There's just something freaky going on. Maybe sometimes he's like, God, I got to get this done. But I think he just really, really, really loves it. And there's just no way that he's not going to repeat himself. He writes so much. He's just a freak.
Yeah.
I mean, I think many people, I would wish that I could be like that. I would be just ecstatic if I could be a little bit like Stephen King. But for people like me, who want to do writing, I really love it. But then maybe sometimes I am forcing. I think it's good to keep writing and forcing and getting into contact with your unconscious. But sometimes I know I'm pushing it and I'm not really listening, I guess.
Yeah.
I just say, yes, thank you for that idea. Now I'm going to go back into consciousness and write it down. Basically, I don't think it's the unconscious's fault. I think it's my fault in not really listening closely enough and saying, thanks for that little bit of inspiration. Now fuck off. Yeah. I'm going to write an episode of 24.
Yeah.
Also a good show. But I'm just going to write what I've seen. And I think in my not listening to myself, I recycle fluff. And I think people could fall into that. And I think sometimes action sometimes is that. But I think there's nothing wrong with pursuing that, because that is really thrilling to get hooked on that action and write it.
Yeah.
We can't all be freaks like Stephen King.
I guess there has to be a place for catharsis with an action, though, right? When you start a story off with action, it's always going to be meaningless because we don't know who the characters are and we don't know what they want or what's at stake. We learn throughout the story, but we don't really learn. You know what I mean? So I think that there has to be a way to have conflict and action in a way adds to the themes of the story, that strengthens that unconscious kernel that inspires the story from the very beginning. For me, the perfect example of this is at the end of Shakespeare's Hamlet, where you have the sword fight with the poisoned daggers. And, the scene has been, I don't want to say parodied, but I'll say reused in stories like Dune. But it's the culmination of so much conflict and so much desire and so many images written on the page that it reaches a climax to the story. And that is when action is used right. But, to use your language, when it's a TV rerun that we're just watching again and again and kind of flipping through the channel, we just see a chase. It's nothing. It's literally nothing.
Yes. Sometimes nothing is good. Everything is nothing. Nothing is everything.
Good words to end on. All right. We got 3 more stories in this anthology, and then we are moving on to The Weird by Jeff Vandermeer. So let's keep at it. Talk to you later, Bob.
Talk to you later, Zach.